Hello, this is your warning that this episode of False Dichotomies will contain some very explicit discussion of genital anatomy and medical alterations thereto. It gets pretty gross and very detailed. You will probably flinch. If you don't, I'm pretty sure you're not even human. So, be warned. Welcome back to False Dichotomies. I'm Cy Castells.
I'm Daria Quinn.
And today we're talking about Dar Williams, The Honesty Room, one of my favorite albums by one of my favorite folk artists. And I believe this is your first introduction to Dar Williams?
I have been somewhat aware of her for a little more, about a year and a half.
Yeah?
Completely due to you.
Okay.
There was a post that you put up on Facebook, I would say about a year and a half ago, about this guy that decided to chew you out because...
Here's the story. I was out with my girlfriend. We had some produce that we'd picked up from the produce co-op, and she wanted to get some more stuff from the grocery store. So since I was carrying the produce from the co-op, I opted to hang out outside the grocery store so people wouldn't think that I was stealing vegetables. So I had my headphones on. I was listening to, I think it might have actually been this album, either that or The Mortal City, which is another very good album. And at the time I had a modified version of a mohawk, which is a very popular hairstyle among NBs these days.
It's very gender ambiguous.
Yes. And and this guy with a completely shaved head, he walked past me and then he turned around, looked, and he shouted something at me I couldn't pick out because of my headphones. I pulled out my headphones and I said, "What?" And he said, "What are you listening to?" And I said, "Music." and he said again, "What are you listening to?" And I said, "Dar Williams." and he looked really confused and he said, "I don't know who that is." and he started to walk away and I said, I'm sorry." and he said, "I just want you to know, just because you shave your head like that don't make you a punk." And I said, I didn't say it did. And he kept walking away and he said, "I'm old school." And as far as I can tell, Dar Williams is pretty punk rock. I mean, she's a folk rock artist, but she's really badass and does a lot of really hardcore political and emotionally raw content. So that's my story.
And to my knowledge, she's very much a DIY artist.
Yeah.
Especially this one, which she produced on her own label.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as far as what is and is not punk rock, I don't know, having your own label is pretty damn punk rock to me.
Yeah, and this particular album has songs that are extremely anti-war, anti-nuclear proliferation, anti-gender restrictions.
Yeah.
There's one song that I'm sure we'll have a good time talking about, where a bunch of New England women go after a child molester.
Okay, it's I figured it felt like it was inferred more than it was directly said. So
but it does say, "Let the kids take a peek." So yes. But we'll get that. That's pretty late in the album.
My exposure to Dar Williams, beyond your anecdote, was, okay, I saw this name. I'm like, okay, who is Dar Williams? And I do the YouTube search.
Okay.
And the one song that really stuck with me in that search was a song called "As Cool as I Am."
Oh, that's a really good one.
Yeah.
That's off the Mortal City album.
And it's just this song about how patriarchy sets women at each other's throats.
Oh yeah.
And she's like, "No, I'm not going to do that. I will not be afraid of women."
Yeah, that's a really powerful song, and it's kind of a healing song for young women who are sick of the drama, basically. And so she actually does a lot of songs that push back against traditional and conventional ideas of femininity, especially femininity that is manipulated by the patriarchy. So, and that's part of the reason why I wanted you to listen and get your perspective, because as a woman who defies every gender stereotype out there.
Some of that defiance was thrust upon me.
Yes. Speaking of genders, the first song on this album is very much about gender and about how gender roles cut both ways. It's called When I Was a Boy. It's from a female perspective, but it's about remembering being a child, and how sometimes during childhood, gender roles are not as strictly enforced. So children get to experiment a little bit more fluidly with their gender, or at least express themselves more freely without. And people will be like, "Oh, it's okay. They're just a kid. They don't know any better." Whereas once they get older, they're like, "Oh no, you don't. You need to start acting like a girl. You need to start acting like a boy." And that freedom suddenly becomes very restricted.
To me, When I Was a Boy, it comes off as sort of a eulogy to lost freedom.
Yeah.
And that Dar is lamenting over the fact that she was once not confined to this idea. In the second verse of the song, she talks about she used to ride around on her bike without a shirt on.
Yeah.
But then as she grew up, she was in the women's clothing section where you're encouraged to show X amount of skin, not for your own comfort, for basically the entertainment of men. And she would go back and like, when I was a kid, they yelled at me for not wearing a shirt, and now they want me to show off my tits.
Yeah, and suddenly it's like, when you're doing it on your own terms, it's empowering, but when it's being like thrust on you as like something that will serve other people's interests, suddenly it becomes really icky, and that's when people start to rebel against it.
And something like that isn't necessarily a hard drawn line. How much of that is empowerment and how much of that has been outside messages that you've internalized?
Now, this is something that I think I understand as someone who has lived as a woman for many years. It's a lot harder to get sucked into the male gaze when you're looking at an attractive woman if you know what it's like to be seen in that way.
Right.
And I think that is what, like, lesbians might have an easier time, like, other women in a more holistic sense, since they know, wait, am I looking at this woman the way that I would like to be looked at myself? And whereas men don't necessarily, cis men at least, don't have that kind of self-awareness built in, I think.
It's either that the self-awareness is not built in, or that cis men are trained to ignore it.
Yeah.
And from my experience as apparently a cis man at some point in my life,
ostensibly,
I would lean towards the trained to ignore.
And that kind of fits into this song too, because at the end of the song, she meets a man who, much like her, sort of resents and regrets the restrictions imposed on him when he grew into masculinity, and how he used to talk to his mom and cry and gather flowers, and how he can't do those things anymore because they're not considered masculine, and how he has lost some kindness. And in like talking to each other about those mutual regrets and mutual restrictiveness, both of them lost a significant amount of freedom when they were trained into their genders.
Unfortunately, this is not a thing I have a lot of experience with, because to my recollection, my gender was policed pretty much from the moment I can recollect. I don't know whether it was because I presented things in too feminine a fashion, or if it had something to do with my parents' insecurities, particularly my dad. To spare deep details, I had a birth defect which required reconstruction of the urinary tract. So basically, the penis didn't come out right. I had to fix it.
You posted about that on social media. I think it was in a comment on one of my posts, actually.
Yeah.
I've actually done a lot of research into genital abnormalities because partly due to my being non-binary, I've always been drawn to research not just of non-binary gender identity but non-binary sex or intersex conditions. When you you didn't describe it in too much detail, but I kind of wonder.
Oh, it's a condition known as hypospadias.
That's the one I was thinking of, actually. So yeah.
So that basically means that the urinary tract was not located in the shaft, rather than at the tip of the penis.
And that is an intersex condition because it is the urinary tract follows the orientation typical in cis female bodies.
And in the midst of my mental breakdown that was caused by many things, overwork, stress from parents, inability to make peace with my gender identity, I got on my parents' case about was I intersex? Was I born the way you said I was? Because I had at that point seen so many stories of intersex people who did not find out until adulthood that they had surgeries done to them when they were a child to basically define their gender based on
force them into a certain physiological norm.
My urinary tract would be placed very likely where a woman's urinary tract would have been. I basically straight up said, "Are you lying to me? Have you been lying to me all these years? Is the fact that I need to go and have my urinary tract reopened every couple of years because it doesn't want to stay open? Is the fact that I'm living with the trauma of my urinary tract closing up on me multiple times in my life? A lot of my gender identity is informed by this trauma. And whether or not I was actually intersex or if it was just hypospadias. And even then, what you just said about hypospadias being one of the intersex conditions,
it's considered one. I think that it's possible that your parents didn't lie to you. It's possible that the doctors lied to your parents.
That's a possibility.
Because that's another thing that happens a lot with intersex children is that the doctors will keep the true nature of the child's intersex condition a secret from the parents out of the fear that if they said to the parents, your baby is neither male nor female or both, that the parents would then reject the child, which is a very real possibility. So I can sort of almost sympathize with the doctor's reluctance, but it's really unethical.
Yeah.
And I think that it is to then damage the child's self-concept and bodily autonomy on the grounds that if you allow the child to exist as who they are, it will be unacceptable to their parents. It's really gross, and if that's something that happened to you, that's terrible. And I'm sorry.
This is a recurring conversation in my counseling, my therapy.
All right.
So it's not, I am definitely addressing the issue. It's just that, like you said, the doc, maybe it wasn't my parents, maybe it was the doctor. And I have no way of finding this doctor now. I have no way of contacting him. And quite frankly, I don't know if there would be a medical record.
Yeah, that's another thing that happens sometimes.
Because of that. And I've heard so many horror stories of intersex people who found out in adulthood that they were intersex because a medical document got into their hands that, by accident in some cases.
Yeah, as from all the research I've done, hypospadias is considered an intersex condition. So if that's what you had, then yes, you are intersex. Yeah. And you can feel free to claim that label.
Well, to compound this, I was referred to a urologist at Cleveland Clinic. And I go in and they tell me, oh, by the way, there's a 2-step process that can basically completely restructure your issues. But you need to lose a significant amount. Okay, so they recommend me to bariatric. I'll see them in October. But here's the thing. Do I go through with the reconstruction of what exists, or do I go for reassignment? And that is a question I don't know.
Like, also from what I know, I'm not a doctor.
Right.
I've just done a whole lot of reading. This is one of the subjects that I hyper-focused on when I was going through.
Understandable.
Through my multiple gender crises. If you had just been left alone as a baby, then yeah, you would have had to sit while peeing down like a girl.
But I do that now anyway.
Yeah, but it would have been fine, and you would probably never have needed these recurring surgeries.
Well, I mean, I basically have been sitting down my entire life.
Yeah.
I mean, there was maybe a couple years when I was really young, but especially after the first stricture correction, the first time they had to reopen the urinary tract, they basically said, look, it's going to go everywhere because whatever. You're just, if you're concerned about pissing on yourself, just don't stand up.
That's something about intersex conditions, especially the ones that just have to do with the genitalia are not shaped the way that we are conditioned to expect them to be shaped. Any surgery done on them to, quote, correct them is usually only cosmetic. We are worried that when you get older and you figure out what a normal penis is supposed to look like, you will look down and think, oh, there's something wrong with me. So instead of allowing you an opportunity to decide whether you want to accept your body the way it is or fit into some societal norm, we're going to take that choice away from you. So you never have the opportunity to,
So you can't see it. You can't see it over the audio, but I am somewhat holding back laughter because that's what happened to me anyway. I looked down at this malformed thing and thought I was some kind of freak. And the dread of the conversation I would need to have with sexual partners over, oh, by the way, there's some scarring, there's some other stuff. The opening is not quite where it's supposed to be. The thing was, about sitting down to pee, that was a sticking point in the boys' bathroom.
I bet it was.
Yeah.
I sit to pee myself because I have...
Right.
I do not have the equipment to do otherwise.
Right. The boys would jump over the stall, peek under the stall, kick in a door. I was never afforded dignity or privacy. It got so bad that I started to intentionally dehydrate myself so I wouldn't need to use the bathroom at school. And that does not help with somebody that already has pre-existing urinary tract and a family history of kidney issues. So I have stage 3 kidney disease now. While that may not have been caused by the damage I did in high school, it certainly did not help.
Well, the moral of the story, folks, is don't mess with that. Don't mess with those body parts unless absolutely necessary, and teach your kids to respect other kids' privacy. And normalize your body. Yeah, there's all kinds of different kinds of bodies. There's just like with the social construction of disability, there's a social construction of genital anatomy and what forms are considered normal and what are considered abnormal. It wasn't an intersex condition, but I had a slight genital rarity. Specifically, I had what's called a septate hymen.
I have no idea what that is.
Well, the hymen is the little bit of flesh.
But
for our listeners who might not be, the hymen is the little bit of flesh that covers the vaginal opening, or partially covers the vaginal opening. Usually, the thing that supposedly breaks during during one's first penetrative intercourse, but it can also break at other times in other ways, and it might not break during intercourse. So when people say the hymen is an indicator of virginity, it's bullshit. But usually the hymen is shaped sort of like a crescent.
Okay.
It covers the back part of the opening and leaves a hole in the front part. There are a couple of different variations. The one that I had is a septate hymen, which is a little thin strip that runs from the back to the front, leaving 2 holes on either side. One hole on either side. And that got caught on tampons.
Oh,
yes,
that can't be good.
It was painful, and over the first, let's see, from age 12 to age 22, so 10 years, it stretched longer and longer and longer until it was like dipping down like a couple of inches down. And what happened at the age of 22 was I was still a virgin, and I was pretty sure that even if I did have penetrative intercourse, I probably wouldn't break it anyway because it had stretched so far, but it was still getting caught and still hurting. It was causing a lot of trouble, so I decided to cut it.
Yourself?
Yes.
Oh!
Yes.
Please, listeners at home, if you're contemplating something similar,
yes,
don't do it yourself. Go to a doctor.
Yeah, I do not recommend doing this. I did it because I did not like doctors, and I still don't. And it bled a lot more than I anticipated, and I ended up like looking pale for a couple of days after that.
Yeah.
So
if that was the worst of it, you were lucky.
Yeah, and on top of that, there was all kinds of risk of infection. So don't do this at home. But yeah, that was like, there's a lot of shame and a lot of emotional weight attached to these slight variations.
Right. And
like, I like to tell that story because I know that it's estimated approximately a 0.1% of people with vaginas have a septate hymen. With 7 billion people in the world, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And if telling that story can help people realize, wait a minute, I'm not a freak. This isn't a sign that I'm broken or defective. Then yeah, I want to keep telling that story. And same goes for anybody with hypospadias or any other condition that you may have been told is a birth defect or a disordered anatomy. We got to that by talking about a song about gender roles and how they affect children as they turn into adults.
I guess this next song would be of a lighter subject matter?
A little bit.
Certainly lighter than what we've been discussing.
Yeah, although there's still time to wreck this one too.
Oh.
So Alleluia is an excellent example of what I love about folk rock, and that is that it can tell stories, sometimes really fantastical stories that have really poignant meanings. And Alleluia is about a teenager who dies and goes to heaven due to her own self-destructive behavior and hates it there. Because they're a rebellious teenager, and everybody there is so happy and cheerful, and there's always singing, and the cafeteria is the worst.
But then a fellow rebel comes into play.
Yep.
And it makes heaven a little more bearable.
There she was this morning getting fitted for her wings. Leather boots, magenta hair, and saying nasty things. I'd say she was an angel, but it's stupid and it's obvious. I said you'll hate it here because we're the only ones like us. It's crypto-fascist mania. It's silicon deliria. Yeah, she said, you're right, but I like the cafeteria.
I see a sort of Daria and Jane dynamic to this. Daria and Jane would come along later. But the dynamic of these two outcasts that kind of find solace in each other, but also solace in the fact that they can rely on each other to kind of snark on everybody else.
Yeah.
It's like, the cafeteria is a pain when you're by yourself, but it's so much more fun when you're with somebody else and you're both kind of observing the stupidity.
Yeah.
And having fun with it.
I actually read the cafeteria line a little bit differently.
Okay.
Because, like, in an earlier verse, she, like, rails against this cafeteria. And it reminds her of this big Hawaiian party that her mother had. And when she finds out that this other rebel who shows up that she bonds with actually likes the cafeteria, I thought, wait, that means that the narrator of the song doesn't hate the cafeteria because it's like there's anything wrong with it, but just because of the associations with authority, with conformity, with all these things. And maybe there's something about that cafeteria that this other person missed in life. Like, maybe this was someone who came from a family that was like chronically hungry or something. And it was like, I've never seen so much food. You know? It's like, so it's like a lesson that sometimes the things you snark on, it's not necessarily because there's something wrong with them. Maybe it's just that there's some pain inside of you that you're tying to that experience.
And something that is just it's a staple of folk music is not only the storytelling element of it, but that many folk singers are collectors of stories. You know, in the olden times, you had the troubadour who would share the oral traditions that predate history.
Yep, the original meme lord.
We don't have dedicated troubadours.
Yep.
Because
we have mass media, we can communicate over long distances in other ways, but in some way that's kind of lost the human connection in that way.
And so folk music is that connection to something that has been part of humanity since before we understood ourselves.
And it's a tradition that's been carried on for, like, there's lots of contemporary folk artists who are carrying on that tradition in a modern context. And they're not just singing songs about, like, medieval times. They're singing songs about modern times, right, in the same style.
The Great Unknown gets very specific about someone who grew up during the Cold War, which I grew up at the very end of the Cold War, and by the time I was in middle school, it was over.
I get the impression this is a story about maybe the people who grew up maybe were born during the 50s, grew up during the 60s and 70s, the flower children and the hippies, who were reviled for their anti-war action. But this is sort of like putting that anti-war rhetoric into a context that is, it's not just about like, oh, these youngins think they know better than their elders. It's these people are desperately trying to save the world with whatever tools they have.
And it's set up like the proliferation of nuclear power is the thing that destroyed the nuclear family, not the protesters, not the hippies. You know, it was the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the Cold War, Vietnam. It was not a loss of morality in the populace. It was the populace going to war in a time where people were waking up to the fact that, hey, war is not a good thing.
Yeah,
we just had 2 world wars, and we pretty much saw the worst of humanity. And that's on all sides too. I mean, the United States is not the moral high ground because, hey, they dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan because they didn't want to lose the ground troops in an invasion.
Yeah.
So of course you're going to have a perpetual nuclear death machine that goes on for decades afterwards. People are still getting nuclear poisoning there.
I think we're seeing the same story being repeated today with the snowflakes.
Yeah.
And like we got the older generations thinking that millennials are entitled, lazy, and think they know better than their elders. But really, we're just trying desperately to save the world from the evils that we see destroying our families, whether they're our born families or our chosen families.
And I think that what has happened to the baby boomer generation in particular is that they latched onto a very shallow version of what the counterculture or the hippie culture was. And they didn't really dive into the fundamentals. They didn't understand what the Black Panthers were fighting for instance.
Yeah.
You know, they were all about, you know, running around naked and having free sex with everyone and their mother.
Mm-hmm.
Then they grew up and, well, that stuff didn't work out for them. So they turned into their parents.
Yeah.
And their parents were extremely conservative. I got mine, fuck you. And of course, this was a time where marginal tax rates were at their highest. So we could afford, you know, people could afford to be like, you know, I got mine, fuck you, because the government was getting all this money so they could build roads and schools and hospitals and Social Security and, you know, all of that. And the baby boomer generation latched onto that because, well, it worked for our parents. And then, of course, they elect Ronald Reagan and fuck everybody.
Yeah.
And not saying that Ronald Reagan is the end-all, be-all, but that I would say Reagan was a definitive point.
I think that this runs into, like, two theories that I have about the way the world works these days.
Right.
One is that, like, people... Now, this is something I've heard since I was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a sentiment that I think goes back a lot farther than that. And that is, you will get more conservative as you get older.
No, you won't.
The thing is, boomers probably got more conservative as they got older.
Yeah.
But I think they're confusing correlation with causation. Because what else happened is that boomers, in aggregate, got wealthier as they got older. And typically, wealthier people are more likely to be conservative because conservative politics favors the wealthy.
Right.
And what happens with millennials and Gen X, we came of age and then had a couple of really bad economic crises.
One on top of the other.
And I dropped out of college and attempted to enter the workforce in 2009.
And that... Oh my God, I am so sorry.
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
It was a long time before I even found a job. And when I did, it was not good jobs. I had long periods of unemployment. And my experience was not atypical of my generation. Even people who did complete college and entered the workforce with a degree, they ended up even arguably in a lot worse condition because they had just as much trouble finding a job, and on top of that, they had the student loan debt. And on top of that, the morale hit of going through 4+ years of college and coming out with not even part-time work. It
is becoming increasingly rare when someone can leave college and find a job in their field, let alone an entry-level job that will accept them, because it's like, oh, it's entry level, but you need X number of years of experience, and like, it's entry level, but it's insane. And you know, the alternative is unpaid internships, and it's like they want your labor for free, and we're expected to be okay with that because it's supposed to be a learning experience. Okay, look, I wrote freelance for a long period of my life. I'd say about 10 years for entertainment and wrestling websites. Never got paid once for 10 years. 5 of those years were spent not only writing a column, reviewing a wrestling show that I despised, and producing a podcast that required about a 40-hour work week in order to complete. And this is on top of the job I already have. I get nothing for it. Absolutely nothing. I will not do that again. If you are not going to pay me, I am not going to provide content for you. We do this because I enjoy it, and I believe that this is important to do. But if you want me to contribute to your website, you will pay me, or you will fuck off.
And I'm glad that you think this is work worth doing, because like I enjoy it too. But the other thing that I think goes into this political shift, where the younger generation is not getting more conservative as they get older. Now, I was born a couple of years before the Cold War ended. So I grew up in the immediately post-Cold War period. What I knew of the Cold War came from movies like War Games and TV shows like MASH.
Yeah.
I still have not seen it all the way through, but I would like to. But Dr. Strangelove.
Right.
Where I learned about the Cold War, the lesson was it was a huge fucking mistake on all levels.
Oh, yeah.
It was paranoid, delusional politicians, like putting the entire planet on the line because they didn't want to consider that the commies might be right about anything.
Which leads us to the modern day.
And suddenly, communism is seeing a renaissance in American rhetoric.
And that is threatening conservative mindsets.
Absolutely.
That is white power structures, specifically. And it is really threatening about 12 people in the United States. So, oh no, the billionaires. We can't harm the billionaires. Fuck the billionaires.
I hear they taste good with ketchup. Yeah, so The Great Unknown is, I really like how it sounds almost like an electric violin. I don't want to say for sure. There's this really ethereal, but still like really hard-hitting sonic environment in this song that I think really underscores how like this is a spiritual battle. It's not just lives on the line. It is all life on Earth on the line.
It is the collective human soul. The degeneration of the collective human soul, and there's a line trying to put the atom back together. In a sense, I is like a lament. While I'm trying to reverse the damage that's being done.
And the next song is bringing it down a little bit to a much smaller scale crisis, and that is When Sal's Burned Down, and that's about the loss of a neighborhood bar and what it meant to that community. So I think it's really interesting going from The Great Unknown to When Sal's Burned Down, because they're both about destruction, and they're both about like trying desperately to save yourself from that destruction. But it's, again, in a much smaller scale. But Sal's was Sal's was a bar where there wasn't anyone trying to sell their souls. They were only trying to buy them back. And you'll never know the true throne that you've lost till the vinyl bar stools are gone.
It's something that I'm getting from that, and maybe is not intentional, but for the working class. And I know because I used to hang out at Redneck Farm in the hometown I was before I moved here, and it was like basically the local watering hole. And it was the one place where the working class knew that it was their place.
Yeah.
And you could drink with your friends, and hey, there's local sports, and you BS with each other, and play pool, and whatever else. And it's just kind of, sometimes there's bands, sometimes there's karaoke. I went there for karaoke. And one of the few things in my life I wish I still had was karaoke. And I have not been able to find one in Canton that I can realistically get to and get home from without being in a giant crowd of people. That was the thing I really liked about Chevy's, was it was small. And unless there was like a really big event, which only happened maybe once or twice a year, it had maybe 20, 30 people at most at a given time. So I just kind of feel like whatever Sal's was to Dara or the people that she's talking about, I don't know how much of this is personal experience and how much of this is experience from people that she's known. Again, the whole collector of stories thing. And she likens it to the end of the silent film era.
I think that in that sense, it was like, it went without a lot of fanfare.
Yeah.
It was just like, suddenly something was missing. It wasn't until like much later in retrospect that people realized that they had lost something really great. Apart from the like silent film stars themselves, and I think this story is told in most famously told in Singin' in the Rain, which is about the end of the silent movie era.
Right.
Everybody was all excited about talkies. It's the big new thing, not realizing that in gaining this new technology and this new way of creating things, we were losing something that would many years later be remembered with reverence.
And the thing about actors in the silent films, they didn't have the luxury of dialogue.
Yeah.
And so they had to tell their story with physical movements.
Yeah. It was a kind of visual acting that was really it had to be so exaggerated, and like Charlie Chaplin is like famous for like people didn't recognize him without that mustache.
Right.
So it's like it was those visual signifiers, whereas these days there's fewer actors who are known for like looking a certain way,
Right.
and it's more about sounding a certain way. I mean, who like most amazing performances of recent cinema history have been vocal performances, like Heath Ledger's Joker, and like things that you can just like recognize in a soundbite.
The thing about the silent film and that style of acting kind of goes to pro wrestling in the sense that it is about physical storytelling. It is about the exaggerated physical acting. Wrestling before the age of cable television, they did small studio shows where, it'd be like 30, 50 people, and they'd watch like, the star go up against the local bum, and they'd do these shows so you would come to the arena show to watch the stars fight the other stars. And they didn't have the big screen televisions back then that they would post in the arenas. So if you're in an arena of 30,000 people and you're in the nosebleeds, Ric Flair is about the size of my fingernail. And unless he's flopping around and wooing and chopping and all the stuff that Ric Flair does, you can't tell what's going on. It's like, if two guys are in a headlock and they're the size of my index finger's nail, how do you know, like, you're not going to be able to appreciate the subtleties the way that you can on television now, or with the arenas where they have these big screens and they have a camera in everybody's face.
Kind of makes me wonder how common it is for wrestling fans to bring opera glasses with them.
Surprisingly, no, but you would think they would.
It might not be the safest thing, because like when you're going to the opera, you're probably not expecting like your possessions to be grabbed and thrown.
yeah, but it's that has changed. That has changed with the advent of cable television and arenas getting these big screens and stuff like that. So it's not as apparent now, and in fact, there is sort of a lost art to that.
Yeah.
But in the sense that's sort of it's similar to what happened as far as silent pictures is you once had this art form that was completely based in your ability to tell stories without words.
Yeah.
And that's taken away. I feel like today's actors don't understand what it is to tell a story without words. And the ones that are really good can do that.
Yeah, I think that to get back to this song though,
right.
there's another cinema reference. In the last verse, it says, "If you toss around some words, you might say that Sal, the owner of the bar, was carrying a torch for the mob. But the mob's gone too. Yeah, the only sign of them left is on every screen at the multiplex. And there's no cowboys in this Connecticut town. No, not anymore. Not since Sal's burned down." So it's like, again, connecting this bar to a certain style of movie that which itself is reminiscent of a period of history that's gone by. Just like the Western movie era was long after the Western era of history, and lasted a lot longer than it. And now the Western movie era is long gone and is only seen these days through deconstructions and parodies. There's this definite sense that things will change, and once they change, you can only see them again through this lens of reminiscence. And you can imagine that, like, when people were going to Sal's bar and and enjoying that space, they weren't enjoying it for what it was. They were in there probably remembering some long forgotten era that they regret not having still, or envisioning some future that they hope would come. And so there's this sense that we're never living in the moment. We're always either looking forward to something we hope will come to pass, or looking back with regret at something we've lost.
The Babysitter's Here.
Yeah.
And this is the other song that really hit me on this album.
It hits me hard too. It's a song about a teenage girl's first heartbreak as told through the eyes of the child that she's babysitting. And yeah, it's a tearjerker. I listen to it and I still just It's this one and the next song, You're Aging Well. Those two, like, both hit me like a double whammy, and I just start bawling my eyes out. But, because, like, they're two ends of the age spectrum.
You have this story of this young child watching somebody else's relationship. The bond that this child made to their babysitter. So much so that when their babysitter was in a school play, that the family went to see her, and it's like, I'm so excited, I want to give you this great card because you were amazing, because you were a unicorn, and the play was a unicorn, so you were the star, and your boyfriend was, I guess I should have seen the signs earlier.
Yeah.
And then you tell me you'll never be with a guy that makes you choose. One, she made the right choice because she's going to school and not with him.
Yes. So the choice being, like, the child asks, will they get married with kids of their own? He says, not if she's going to college, we won't. And, oh my God, what a fucker.
And then that's a pretty blatant thing to say to a kid, too. Like, you're not even hiding how you feel. So this was clearly something the two of them had been arguing about rather frequently, with some significant heat to it. Yeah.
And there's other signs. There's, like, she got mad when Tom had a beer at dinner. And this being at the babysitter's, or the babysitting gig, it's probably like, oh, yeah. You don't, if you're with your girlfriend and she's babysitting, you don't fucking take a beer from the refrigerator, because, like, that's not your beer.
Right.
You're probably not of age.
Or if he is, that makes this worse.
Yeah, and, like, and that kind of, like, reminds me how, like, we sometimes fall in love when we're young with people who are very bad for us. Yeah. And that was true of me. I didn't start dating until I was 21, but when I did, I dated a conservative Christian who believed that Obama was born in Kenya, and it was not the best relationship, and it ended in part because he had expectations of me as then I was a woman. Like, he had expectations about my sexual conduct that I wasn't willing or able to conform to.
So basically what you're saying is he wanted a wife and a mother that would lie beneath him and never question his manhood.
Oh, it's a little more complicated than that. He wanted me to be in charge of making sure we didn't behave in an unchaste manner.
If you're going to get... Okay, so clearly this is the unchaste manner before you marry.
Yes.
So what was he going to think would happen after you marry?
I don't know. I mean, like, because, like, I had this idea that, if he doesn't want to have sex before marriage, I love him enough to follow that rule. But if he was going to show me affection, I was going to return it. Right. Because I wanted him, like, very, very strongly. Yeah. I had a very high sex drive and still do. Oh, I don't even know how he would have reacted if we had stayed together and I had eventually come out to him as trans. That would have been...
That couldn't have ended well.
It would have almost certainly ended in divorce. But, like...
Now, this was not the guy you eventually married.
No. Okay. No, this was just my first boyfriend. But, like, it just, like, brings back, like, I have heard so many stories of people, like reminiscing about, like, their first relationships and thinking, what the fuck was I thinking being with someone like that? Because I think that when we're young, we're thinking with the parts of ourselves that don't foresee these incompatibilities. And maybe this babysitter was like found him attractive, and maybe he did some things for her early on that were really sweet, but he wanted her to sacrifice her academic ambitions to be with him. And in the end, she chose not to, but it still broke her heart.
Oh, yeah.
And, like, in the last scene, it's, like, the child comforting her while she's crying over this breakup. And it's sort of a growing up moment for both of them, because she's realizing that that she needs to make some tough decisions in her life. And the child is realizing that the adults and near adults who she relies on to take care of her sometimes need to be taken care of themselves. And that's a tough thing for a child to learn as well.
You're aging well.
So this, again, goes back to, like, the way that Dar Williams talks about gender, because age is something that is not considered acceptable in women for the most part. And this is a song about learning to stand up to that and, like, fight back against it. I really love the line, "Why is it that as we get older and stronger, the road signs point us adrift and make us afraid, saying you never can win, watch your back, where's your husband? Oh, I don't like the signs that the sign makers made." Yeah, it's, as I get older, and I'm only 31, but I feel middle-aged, and part of that is because I've been through so much in my life. I feel a lot older than I am.
That's a typical millennial thing.
It's also a typical trans thing, I think.
Yeah.
Because the harder your life is, the faster you age, I think.
Yeah.
Because it's hard on our bodies, it's hard on our brains, it's hard on our hearts. We also get wisdom through that. And I think and that's something that I get from this song is that, yeah, you have more scars, more wrinkles, you get tired more easily, you're more cynical, and the world maybe doesn't value you as much when you are young and hot, but you have this wisdom. Mm-hmm. And I think as a society, we used to value wisdom. And I think it's time we started to value it again. It used to be like people would take pride in gray hairs.
Yeah.
Like, the reason that white powdered wigs were popular back in the day is because they made you look older. And, like, I have maybe, like, 4 or 5 gray hairs right now. Mm-hmm. But my mother started going gray in her late 20s, and I was hoping for that. I was like, I will look so good. I'll have long hair that's streaked in gray, and it will look so interesting. Mm-hmm. And I haven't got that, and I'm pissed off. Or, like, I've certainly suffered enough to have gray hair. Yeah. One day, we'll see.
Yeah, mine are starting to come in, and I'm looking forward to the day where I don't have to strip my hair completely dead in order to be able to put some color in. I have very, very black hair.
So there's like this war against aging that I think is really counterproductive. We're undermining our own credibility, I think, right, when we're denying ourselves the reality of our experiences. Mm-hmm. I have fights with, like, older people who don't want me to say that I'm old. Oh, because, yeah, like, these are, like, men usually white men, mm-hmm, in their 50s or 60s who are, like, who they see me refer to myself as middle-aged or old, and they're like, "Oh, how dare you?" And I'm like, look, just because you are ashamed of your age doesn't mean that I should be. Yeah, if you're aging, like, take pride in that if you can. Yeah. It's a mark of strength. Mm-hmm. It says, "We're so glad that you finally made it here. You thought no one cared, but we did. We could tell. And now you'll dance through the days while the orchestra plays, and oh, you're aging well." It's reaching a higher level. Mm. It's like leveling up, right, so to speak. And you can only do that if you've been living for quite a while and racking up all these experiences.
That's something that video games get right, by the
way. Yeah. You can't just, like... Because it's also not just about how long you've been playing. It's about how much you've been doing in the game.
Exactly.
And I think that's why I can call myself middle-aged, even though I'm only 31.
Right.
I am divorced. I have put myself back together after falling apart multiple times. Oh, yeah. I have lost everything and gained everything back multiple times. I have lived independently, and I have learned how to live collaboratively with people who didn't necessarily fit in with me perfectly. And I have lost those connections and gone back to living independently and getting used to that again. It's like I have lived through a lot that these 50 or 60-year-old white men who say that I'm not allowed to call myself old have never experienced. And I think that's made me wise, and I'm not afraid to say so.
On my end, it's 20 years of untreated mental illness, bad relationships, bad job experiences, and of course, gender dysphoria.
And I think that does tend to prematurely age people as well. Because, like, one thing I hear over and over again from trans people is that they feel old because there's something about having your youth stolen from you.
Yeah.
We end up not having a childhood in the way that we kind of expected to have. Especially, and I think the older you are when you transition or come out, the more resentment you might feel over that lost childhood or that lost youth. One thing that I feel myself, and I hear a lot of people say, is that once I began transitioning, I was like, I am kicking myself over and over again. Why didn't I do this sooner? Because I could have had so many more years of happiness. Less suffering, at least. And that's something that attaches itself to whatever physical signs of aging we have. Like the YouTuber Chase Ross, who YouTubes about being a trans man. He says that he has severe dysphoria attached to his hair loss because, like, when he went on testosterone, he started losing his hair younger than a lot of men do. He calls, and he has a lot of, like, an emotional distress associated with his hair loss, and he calls it dysphoria because he associated it with the fact that he didn't have as much time as a young man with a full head of hair as he should have. He never had a chance to be himself and young at the same time. Yeah, that's something that I think trans people feel much more acutely than cis people. This discussion will be continued next episode in part 2.